Yeah, it's nice to be here. I'm Sami Keto. I'm an independent researcher, activist. I'm also an ecologist by training, and I used to work in the environmental field and also in some development cooperation projects. But now, the past 5 years, I've focused on empathy, and main result is here, with this book which I wrote with Elisa Aaltola, who gave a talk yesterday here. Okay. Yeah, Elisa told me that she could have sold more books yesterday, so I came to sell a few more. So over here. Yeah, actually, what Satu said at the end, that environmental education or maybe view of life shouldn't perhaps be based on too many scientific facts or details. I kind of agree, but there's a lot of these narratives around that are unhelpful for ourselves as beings, and also for the society and for the whole biosphere. And these narratives, I think, would be good if they were based on science or other like best possible knowledge available. Yeah, I'm gonna start with a quote. Let's not go through this all. Just gonna mention that I changed the sympathies in the quote into empathy because of this book. But these last sentences, I think, are important. In the first paragraph, it says that there's only an artificial barrier to prevent empathy extending to all men, well, all human. And then in the second paragraph at the end, it says that when the empathy becomes even more tender and more widely diffused, it can extend to all sentient beings. So I suppose at least this last sentence sounds a bit like someone like this type of guy, but actually the quote is from Charles Darwin, from the of course, Darwin, how we mostly know him now is through the On the Origin of Species, that book, and all the stuff that comes from there. But he's the later part of his career, he had a lot of other ideas, but they weren't canonized the similar way as this was. Survival of the fittest, which obviously is not coined by Darwin himself, but Herbert Spencer, who was an influential scientist and a public figure at the time of Darwin, and he was obviously also a proponent of unrestricted capitalism, and this kind of fit that image, or the big picture of classical liberalism itself, that nature is all about killing or being killed, and there's this struggle all the time. Also, there's continuous competition about the status in the community, within the species or the communities, but also obviously in between them. Then about 100 years later, another influential scientist, Richard Dawkins, wrote the Selfish Gene book, 1976, I think. which obviously Dawkins meant this as a metaphor, but he still keeps on saying things like we're born selfish and we survival machines, and so it doesn't really help not to take this literally. And unfortunately, people did take this literally, and this goes well with the, let's say, if this classical liberalism had already some major flaws in it, especially when it comes to like empathy and that sort of stuff. But neoliberalism is even worse in that sense. So this is how narratives get formed. That there's a lot of emphasis on something, and then neglection on something, some other elements which could kind of balance the thing a bit. And this is why we have these really unhelpful narratives at the moment. This is an image from the 2001 Space Odyssey. It's in the beginning of the film, The Dawn of Man. Let's call this guy Adam. He picks up a bone from the ground, and he realized that he can actually use this to kill other apes. So they beat a competing tribe, and then triumphantly Adam throws this bone into the air, and the camera follows. And then, just when it starts to fall down, the bone transforms into a spaceship. So the message is quite clear that there's some kind of a destiny of man to, and I could put emphasis on man, obviously, not not human, to conquer first the earth and then the space, and we need tools for that, and tools are used specifically for this kind of conquering and violence and that sort of stuff. Okay, so not all scientists obviously agree with this kind of idea. Franz Duvall is one who doesn't agree, so he kind of makes a mock of it by putting this Väinö theory in place. That it says that is there a pointer in this? Well, anyway, in the middle, the core of human or nature is like really bad, and then when you go into the outer layers, it's still bad, and just the very thin layer on the surface is something that we might call good or moral. And obviously this is not based on facts, this narrative. But anyway, through this we got this unempathetic narrative of life, where individuals exist to pursue self-interest, and for that they compete against each other, whether same species or other species. And the purpose of life is it's just to reproduce and conquer the earth, and in man's case also the space, obviously. That's where the future lies, according to this narrative. Okay, but fortunately, well, there was already that mentioned Franz Duvall, but Lynn Margulis is a very important figure to challenge this kind of narrative. And this endosymbiotic theory is developed already in the early 20th century by some Russian botanists, but then in 1967 Margulis could prove that she was mostly a microbiologist, and she could prove through her experience that this is it's real, and actually it's something that all almost all evolutionary biologists agree that this is the case. Also Richard Dawkins was in the beginning very much against it. What this means is that I'm not going to go through it in detail, but the eukaryotic cells were formed through cooperation of prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic, we are organisms formed out of these eukaryotic cells. So basically, all complex life was or exists through these symbiotic interactions, through cooperation and not competition. This happened already like 1.5 billion years ago. So that's also the end of the era of the individual, although we might think that we're still living in it, but it's way in the past. Okay, and so Margulis said that so evolution is not driven by competition, but through these cooperational interactions and symbiosis. And if we put emphasis on competition, of course it exists on evolution, but it's just a mechanism to select after these kind of the life forming forces have taken place. So the emphasis on competition is mostly ideological. Life doesn't aim at competition, but rather tries to avoid it, because competition always, unlike the economists keep saying, it's not efficient, it always consumes unnecessary energy. This is the latest tree of life from last year that it was published in the Nature. I think it's quite a beautiful image, but most of it, like this, especially this part on the right here. Well, maybe first I show you. This is where somewhere right at the end there's fungi and animals. So most of the diversity in life is bacteria, and these the plants on the right, this purple one, they like completely newly found life forms, and they were found because these researchers understood this interdependence of life, that the bacteria, they can't be cultivated in the lab. They can only be found in connection with other life, and that, for example, that includes the human microbiome, the microbes that exist in human bodies. So like I said, competition does exist in ecosystems. They call business ecosystems as well. It's not my idea. So this is an example what happens if competition drives this evolution. So it leads into. It doesn't lead into diversity, but it leads to less diversity, and it's called in ecology. It's called competitive exclusion principle. So it's a real phenomena, but it doesn't enhance life. It doesn't enhance diversity, rather lessens it. Okay, so this first. Trying to undo this emphasis on competition, and I think Jani Pulkki after me is going to talk more about competition, I hope. But okay, but we could still think that, should we still think ourselves as self-interested organisms, and so that we cooperate because of the self-interest, the individual self-interest. Here lies a very fundamental problem, and I kind of hinted to this already, that we've never been individuals, as Scott Gilbert, the evolutionary biologist, says. This, if looking from a biological perspective, if we were individuals, we would need to be genetically, anatomically, physiologically, immunologically individuals, but we're not. But rather we are a community or an ecosystem, and this, specifically this kind of organism is called holobiont, also a term coined by Lynn Margulis. Well, what this means is that somehow you can see the individual there, but you have to construct it from the web of life. It's there's the human body, and it includes more non-human cells than human cells. So this is mostly bacteria that's in our body, and these microbes are not just like someone who happened to be there, just kind of parasites or whatever, but they very much part of this organism, this holobiont called human. They affect everything in us. They affect obviously the metabolism, but and that's what we've known for a long time. But recent research also shows that it affects like our psychological well-being, and quite importantly, it also has a major role in development. That there's unfortunately these horrible animal experiments where they've raised animals in sterile environments, and they basically grow with major disabilities, mental, cognitive disabilities, also physiological disabilities. So yeah, we're not individuals. So how can we pursue some strange individual self-interest? This holobiont idea doesn't obviously include only humans, but like all more complex forms of life are holobionts. So there's a need to look beyond the individual. Maybe in other cultural heritage we have more. It's more in the core of the philosophy, like the dependence on Buddhism, where all beings exist only through the various interactions, and not as an isolate identity. And then in the African philosophy we have this Ubuntu concept, which basically says that I am because we are. Well, in the Western science also this idea of larger self. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Maybe you've talked about this already. That it's been there, but maybe more like in the marginal. Emil Durkheim talked about social being, and then I'm sure Gregory Bateson have been mentioned here, and his ideas influenced deep ecology and this idea of ecological self. Well, what's common with all these scholars that these social level or larger self is something to aim at. You transcend into it. It's not that you have to sacrifice your individual in the evil forces of the collective. Okay, so basically that's why the most important question in life is not how to pursue self-interest, but rather how to live together. Fortunately, evolution has produced many mechanisms to respond to that questions. Insects have pheromones, and then there's a bunch of other mechanisms, and empathy is one of these, a series of mechanisms to help how to live together. Empathy itself has a long evolutionary history. Maybe previously we've thought that it's only just human or mammals, but that birds, at least birds have it, and even with the similar structures in the nervous system, for example, than mammals. So it has to go way back, at least to dinosaurs. From an evolutionary point of view, empathy is maybe best seen as layers. This Russian doll idea is an idea put through by Franz Duvall again, that there's in the middle or in the core you have these older elements, emotional contagion and so forth, and then on the upper layers you have like some more maybe cognitive perspective taking and so forth. But what's important that they all kind of stay dependent on each other. Like these new layers don't function on their own, but rather in connection with the older layers. And then we've found like a lot of discoveries of other animals. Empathy, these rat studies are quite famous, where they in the experiment they wanted to see whether rats, if given an option to eat nice sweet by themselves or release their companions and share it with them, so they chose the latter. Over 80% of the rats chose this latter option. So they really want to be empathetic and share things rather than pursue some self-interest. So this is part what the more empathic narrative of life consists, that we exist through these relationships that are appreciative. Life or biodiversity is autocatalytic, what it means that biodiversity or life kind of gives space to other life, helps other life forms to coexist and flourish. And purpose of life is this harmony between all species. Thank you.